about the barber. One day, he made
So I guess I had a problem there. I bumped my camera and it caused the USB
again, this
error.
poem kind of falls in line with the whole theory that it is made, again, to be an unassuming or child thing like the Nutcracker or the Jester. As a matter of fact, the kind of poetry to how it's described is very similar to the Nutcracker's bestiary entry. So in my mind, it kind of makes sense if these were designed as some sort of weapon. But again, they're newer to the game and we don't know a ton about them for me to make any definitive conclusions on that. Something that I will make more definitive conclusions on is the other kind of humanoid entity that can appear in mansions, the butler. So when you first see the butler from a distance, you can almost be mistaken that it's a person. It seems to be wearing a suit, has a face and hair, and most of the time when players encounter it, will be sweeping around the interior of a mansion. Again, I believe they can appear outside of mansions, but they're most commonly seen within mansions. However, when you get too close to the butler, that's when the ruse starts to fall apart. Its body isn't shaped right. It's like kind of draped in a cylinder, and its face looks like a pile of skin. You can certainly see how there used to be a person there, and you can see how the suit that it is wearing was probably someone's suit at some point, but that's certainly not a person anymore. When the butler sees a player, it will begin nonchalantly sweeping in the area, but subtly continue to track the player through different rooms. As long as the player isn't alone, this will never change, and the butler will just kind of hover around where the player is. But if a player that is being followed by a butler is alone for, I believe, 12 seconds, it will put away the broom, pull out a knife, and begin to chase and stab the player. And then if that player runs into an area with more players, it will pull out the broom and act like nothing ever happened. It seems that the butler is trying to murder you in secret away from prying eyes. To the degree that if it stabs the player to death, it will even clean up the blood.
I like the
and
mob
move
design.
away from where the body was. Where it gets really interesting is what happens if you kill the butler. Again, with any entity in the game, this is hard to do unless you stun it or use a zap gun and have another player hit it with a shovel. But if you manage to kill a butler, it will quickly swell up and pop. You have to get away from this pop as it's happening because it will damage nearby players and throw them a considerable distance. But in the aftermath of where it popped, a swarm of what's known as masked hornets will appear. And these masked hornets will continue to follow players through the facility, similar to how the butler did, only these can't be killed, but it's kind of easier to outrun. What that means is that the butler is just a drape of skin designed to look like a person, that in reality is a giant bag of hornets. After the butler dies,
giant bag of bees.
The suit that the butler was once wearing.
I love Invader Zim.
Like the
Bees.
in my opinion,
Bees.
one of the coolest monsters in Lethal Company. Like, we're walking around in the remnants of where people used to be. And other than things like the Ghost Girl, there's normally not a sign of them. But then randomly, a swarm of hornets will, I guess, assemble people's skin and put on a suit in order to look unassuming so it can chase people around and stab them to death. That is so cool. In the bestiary entry, it says, the smell is like rotten meat, so bad it puts Richard to shame. I hear flies buzzing around inside their bodies. Jess said she saw something crawl out of its eye socket. This is like classic body horror monsters. I love it so much. There also is a benefit to killing the butler other than just getting rid of it on the map, because when the butler dies, it will drop its knife. The knife can be picked up and is one of the most effective weapons you can use in the game. It does the same damage as the shovel, but it can be swung a lot quicker. Even though you can spam it to swing it a bunch, it only does damage, I think, every 0.4 or 0.45 seconds, but it weighs 0 pounds and is much more usable than things like the shovel. The other benefit to the knife is any other butler can be killed by it in a single hit. This makes sense because if the butler is effectively a giant skin balloon full of bees, then just popping it will cause it to die. But again, this is one of the only direct mentions we get of any kind of remnants of people left through the game. We have the bodies that can be possessed by Mast, we have the spirit of the Ghost Girl, and we have the skin that was left over that made the butler. We don't know exactly what happened on these moons.
I view it as like maybe an AI developer that's really, really cynical and fucked up, like the Saw movies and stuff, and they make a whole bunch of AI robots that behave like this just to plague mankind, and then they unleash the robots, right? It's not that far outside the realm of possibility. I think we basically have that right now.
But we know that it was bad. Because of the remnants we're seeing, it seems that humanity was wiped out and their pieces used to build whatever we're coming across.
Jesus.
And a lot of this seems to be the product of some kind of war, and there is another explicitly war-made entity in the game that sheds a ton of light on what may have happened here. And that is a rather new addition to the game, the Old Bird. So remember how I said, like, the Jester, if it spawns in an interior, the game now becomes a Jester game. And if someone's haunted by a ghost girl, that player now has to play to the ghost girl. If an Old Bird spawns on the exterior, because thankfully it can only spawn on exteriors, if an Old Bird spawns on an exterior when you land, it now becomes an Old Bird game. When the match starts out, the Old Bird will be dormant. It will be standing like a statue in whatever area it spawns. It then has random chances throughout the rest of the day to turn on at any point. Also, remember how I mentioned facility interiors will have an apparatus that runs the power? If you pull an apparatus at any point, that forces any outdoor Old Birds to then turn on. The Old Bird is a stereotypical super mech made for war. It has a giant spotlight for a head, these loudspeakers that blare noises to terrorize people. It has rocket boosters on its feet that it will use to fly around or go up in the air and land on players. And it has a series of rockets that it will fire at anyone it sees. If you're outside and there's an Old Bird, you don't have to worry about eyeless dogs or baboon hawks or anything like that, because if the Old Bird sees it, it will make them a memory. The Old Bird leads to some of the most terrifying gameplay you can run into, but where I'm interested about it is lore. Because while other than the coil head, we don't get explicit mention that things like the Nutcracker were designed as weapons of war, the Old Bird is very explicit in its definition, not only in its design, but in its bestiary. Bestiary entry for the Old Bird reads as follows. The Old Bird is an autonomous, offensive weapon of war with a humanoid design. Measured at 19 feet tall and 11 feet wide, its two most defining visual features are the spotlight positioned on its head, capable of emitting 100,000 lumens, and the long-range acoustic device on its chest, sometimes referred to as a sound cannon. There are additional speakers on its shoulders used to broadcast sound a long distance. The Old Bird's left arm is a claw, and its right arm is a nozzle capable of both launching rocket-propelled grenades and torching at close range with a very hot flame. The birds are one of the first extra-orbital weapons to be used when mass produced. So there we get our definitive note that this was designed as a weapon for war, as an orbital weapon, it says. But then the following paragraph, similar to the paragraph mentioned in the Man-Eater, opens up so many ideas for the world of Lethal Company. The subject of who developed the Old Birds has been an intense debate since their first recorded appearance on December 18th of 2143, when over 50 Old Birds invaded the Anglian capital. This is considered one of the first major causes for the downfall of the Anglian Empire. The most commonly upheld theory takes into account the tension between the Anglian and Beaumont military throughout the 2100s. However, nothing has been proven in the centuries since. The design of the Old Bird, down to the tempering of metals, appears intended to conceal its origin. It has been called the walking ransom letter. Old Bird's legs function as rockets, which allows them to travel long distances and find targets efficiently. But the most likely reason this feature exists is to help them enter and land from orbit. The material and fuel Old Birds rely on is similar to those of passenger spacecraft from around 2130. Old Birds land and stay at their target planet forever. Although they often have more than enough fuel for just one trip, no behavior has been found in their programming which suggests they could choose to migrate. Still, there are unverified accounts of Old Birds traveling autonomously to a new planet after hundreds of years of dormancy. Okay. So, Anglian capital, Beaumont Empire, whatever. This is the only mention we get of it. I could make of that what you will. Like, all of these empires, and there were invasions. Someone sent 50 to a capital, which I could see how one could destroy an empire, much less 50. But someone developed these things in secret somehow, and then used them to attack other moons and colonies, but also they can be sent to a planet and be dormant for hundreds of years. So these things have been around for hundreds of years. It builds up so many questions about the empires, about the war. Perhaps all the remnants we're seeing are the remnants of the Anglian and the Beaumont War. Perhaps one side built the coil heads and the other built the nutcrackers. Perhaps one side built both. Perhaps these conflicts are completely unrelated and there's been a series of skirmishes across space for thousands of years. Who knows? But if one side of a conflict wanted to mass exterminate the entire population of another side, sending a bunch of Old Birds to a planet seems to be an easy way to do that. However, the Old Bird entry just gives us even more lore to dig into Lethal Company's world. As it continues, The old bird was historically referred to as the A1 based off the codename it was given by the English military, the A16L31. In 2384, however, the song Old Birds, released as a cult hit by the post-punk project Under Remora. Just 3 years later, in his most famous work of the same name, street artist Alldayerrydaybaby depicted the automatons flying and landing between planets in an arrangement similar to a flock of geese. This is generally considered one of the most iconic and influential images of modern culture and solidified the modern nickname. In 2356, 5-Embryon was classified as condemned for purposes of travel or settlement by the boat. Old birds were described by witness accounts as lining the horizon, though to this day they appear inoperative. There's a reasonable risk that many are still in sleep mode, so the planet will likely keep its status. Small Moon was likely used as a testing ground for the old bird's flying and landing capabilities. Okay, so this throws our timeline way into the future. We were talking about 1930s, 1960s, and we now have mention of things that happened in 2384. But we have so much stuff here that there is an English military, whatever that means in the far reaches of space, that gives it the designation. But then we also have a mention that there's a song Old Birds made by a post-punk project called Under Remora. So we don't just have militaries and empires, we have art, we have culture developing in space. But we don't see any of that because everything we come across is desolate. And also, crucially, we get our second mention of the boat, the thing mentioned all the way back in the Bunker Spider entry. So the Bunker Spider entry made it out to be that when this boat passed the Thistle Nebula, that these Bunker Spiders grew to the size that they did. But now, hundreds of years later, we see that a planet is condemned for travel or settlement by the boat. This implies that the boat wasn't just a one-time thing, but is either a group or a still existing thing out there in space. However, the Old Bird entry leads us to another secret of Lethal Company's world as well, and that is with the mention of Embryon. The Old Bird entry is interesting for a couple reasons. For one, shortly after that entire description I read was put into the game, in an update, part of it was removed. Everything to do with the Anglin Empire or the Bomok Empire was cut out. And not in a way to say it was retconned or perhaps Zeekerss changed his mind. Instead, you can see where the entry starts and then suddenly cut off and jumps down to the rest of the description. It's almost as if the company or the terminal is censoring information we weren't supposed to see. And similarly, the planet Embryon that was mentioned at the end as being condemned by the boat is now a location we can travel to. There are 2 secret moons in the game that are not listed in the ship's terminal that you just have to type the name in for the ship to take you to. And one of these is Embryon. Similar to the hard level moons, you have to pay to go to Embryon, but out of the paid moons, Embryon is the cheapest, only costing 150 credits to land at. And yeah, you'll never want to go there. Like, I went there one time for footage for this video, and I'm never doing it again. So when you land at Embryon, the entire surface is covered in deactivated old birds. And it is a really long trek to get from your ship to the front door and the fire exit, which is an equal distance away. The interior of Embryon is the same, random spawn chance as any other map, but it is the exterior full of old birds that make it interesting. Because as mentioned earlier, as the day goes on, it is more and more likely for old birds to be activated. And because there are so many on the surface, what effectively happens every time you try to leave the facility is it turns into a match of hell divers, only you don't have a gun and are far more vulnerable. It is chaos, it is a nightmare, it is a challenge map, if there ever was one. However, in the info for this moon, we get some
hell divers, but you don't have guns.
Embryon was discovered in just the last century. It appears to have been used as a testing ground for old birds long before it was officially discovered. As a result of this danger, its status has been marked as condemned. There are theories that a diverse geothermal ecosystem may be thriving within the vast cave network under Embryon's surface. So that raises some interesting points. As mentioned in the bestiary entry, it seems that Embryon was kind of a testing facility or a holding site for old birds. But now it's saying that it was discovered and seems to be, prior to the discovery, a place old birds were sent.
So I'm terribly sorry, guys, but I'm hungover and feeling very low blood sugar, and I think I'm going to lie down for a bit and try to feel better. And so I'm going to take a small break. I'm terribly sorry. I'll be back.